8.0 Knowledge of Ourselves and Others. A person's knowledge of himself is obviously much better than his knowledge of others. You obviously have a much more accurate understanding of your own mind than you do of other people's minds. Nonetheless, we can, within limits, have some knowledge of what others are thinking. It is a matter of considerable dispute how we can acquire such knowledge. But here is a hypothesis that, I think, must surely be correct, at least for some, though perhaps not all, instances of knowledge of others. We can, at least within limits, have direct knowledge of what is going on within our own minds, and we often know how we are likely to behave in response to an experience of a given kind. When others behave in a given way, I tend to ascribe to them the kind of mental state that accompanies instances of my behaving in that way. I know that when I am in pain, I tend to wince or clutch at the wounded part of my body or some such. So when I see somebody else behaving in that way, I tend to assume that he or she is in pain. Comparable points hold with respect to our ascriptions of other kinds of mental states to others. 8.1 Self-knowledge. People know much about themselves. I know that right now I have the intention of producing a helpful essay on the theory of knowledge. I know that right now I'm in a pretty good mood. I know that I enjoy playing the piano. I know that I wish I could play as well as Arthur Rubinstein. I also know that I'm sad that I cannot play as well as he could. All of you have comparable knowledge about yourselves. A striking feature of at least some of our self-knowledge is how direct it is. My knowledge that I'm in a pretty good mood is even more direct than knowledge that I am now typing on a computer. But how is this possible? Isn't my knowledge that I'm now typing on a keyboard as direct as knowledge can be? No. My knowledge that I'm typing on a keyboard is based on the sensory experiences I'm having. These experiences are both visual and tactile. Tactile means having to do with the sense of touch. But given only the nature of those experiences, it is a possibility, if only a theoretical one, that I'm dreaming or hallucinating. My having accurate perceptions of, for example, the computer screen in front of me involves my body's being stimulated in very specific ways by causal processes that originate with that computer screen. Light waves must bounce off of that computer screen and disturb my retinas. Further, those light waves mustn't be distorted or altogether cut off by intervening influences. If there were an uneven, thick piece of glass between me and the screen, those light waves would be distorted, and my perception of the screen would be inaccurate. If there were a piece of thick wood between me and the glass, those light waves would be cut off, and I wouldn't see the screen at all. So my having an accurate perception of the screen involves more than just my having a certain visual experience. That experience must be caused in a very specific way by very specific events in the external world. In other words, the world outside of my body. A corollary is that an experience that is just like the one I'm having, but that is caused in the wrong way, isn't a perception of the screen. Suppose that, using precision instruments, an extremely skillful surgeon is creating disturbances of my retinas that are exactly like the disturbances that would ordinarily be created by light bouncing off of a nearby computer screen. In that case, I will have an experience just like that of seeing a computer screen, even though I'm not seeing a computer screen. There are typically many different ways of creating a given effect. If you want to hang a painting on the wall, there are a lot of different ways to do it. If you want to make it look as though Smith killed Jones, there are a lot of different ways to do that. One way, of course, would be to get Smith to kill Jones, by, for example, paying him to do so. Another would be to frame Smith. Thus, even if Smith is innocent, he can be made to look guilty. Similarly, even if there's no computer screen nearby, my retinas and consequently my nervous system can be made to undergo the kinds of disturbances that would ordinarily be caused by light rays that had bounced off a computer screen. Of course, remarks similar to those just made about visual experiences hold with respect to all other kinds of sensory experience. I'll leave it to you to think of examples of this. Basically, sensory experiences, like forensic data, can be forged. They can be fakes. But such fakery seems impossible when it comes to at least certain kinds of self-knowledge. I can have an experience just like that of seeing a computer screen, even if I'm not seeing a computer screen. But could I have an experience just like that of experiencing intense pain if I weren't experiencing intense pain? Surely not. After all, an experience just like that of intense pain is an intense pain. Of course, what we just said about pain is true of many other psychological conditions. Thus, where some psychological occurrences are concerned, the appearance and the reality merge. By contrast, where knowledge of the external world is concerned, the appearance and the reality are always distinct and are often, in fact usually, separated by a large tract of space. Even where touch is concerned, the object touched is remote from the events in your central nervous system that mediate your experience of the object. Thus, from an evidential and in fact a spatial point of view, knowledge of at least some facts about one's psychological condition is considerably more direct than knowledge of facts about the external world, even when the externalities in question are literally being seen or touched or heard or so on. 8.2. Some limits to self-knowledge. Notwithstanding what was just said, there are reasons to believe that, in many cases, self-knowledge is as difficult to obtain as knowledge of the external world. That, in fact, knowledge of some facts about our own minds is as theoretical and indirect as our knowledge of subatomic events. Before we can discuss these reasons, we must define a term and we must also make a distinction. The term to be defined is consciousness. In everyday speech, that word is ambiguous. Sometimes it simply means knowledge or awareness. For example, in the sentence, Smith's consciousness of the complexities involved in running a municipality is extremely limited. The word consciousness seems to have more or less the same meaning as the term knowledge or awareness. In philosophical contexts, the word consciousness has a different and narrower meaning. In such contexts, it refers to one's immediate experience. Henceforth, we will use the term consciousness only in its narrow philosophical sense. This must be understood aright. The term consciousness does not refer to the objects of your experience. Right now, let us suppose you are feeling a cool breeze. The cool breeze is something you are conscious of. In other words, it is an object of consciousness. But that cool breeze isn't identical with your consciousness or with any part of your consciousness. What is a part of your consciousness is the sensation that the cool breeze causes you to have. What is also a part of your consciousness is your visual perception of the piece of paper that the cool breeze is blowing across your front lawn. But to echo what we said a moment ago, the piece of paper itself is not identical with your consciousness or even with a part of it, even though it is something that you are conscious of. In other words, it is an object of your consciousness. Here we must make a delicate point. Many constituents of our minds exist even when we are sleeping and even when, more generally, they are not occupying our consciousness in any way. You believe that 1 + 1 = 2. But it is only very rare occasions that this belief of yours is occupying your consciousness. Nonetheless, you obviously don't lose that belief when it's not occupying your consciousness. You still have that belief. This is made clear by the fact that it can readily make an appearance in your consciousness. For example, if I tell you that I'll give you an A in the class if you answer the question, what is 1 + 1, you will without any difficulty be able to draw on your belief that 1 + 1 = 2, even though in all likelihood that belief was remote from your consciousness prior to my asking you that question. So that belief, existing as it does when it is outside of consciousness, is not a part of consciousness. It is not, as we will henceforth put it, a constituent of your consciousness. Thus, there are instances of knowledge that are not consciousness, and there are instances of consciousness that are not knowledge. The euphoria induced by a drug is an instance of consciousness. It is a component of somebody's immediate experience, but it isn't an instance of knowledge. This is consistent with the fact that somebody experiencing such a euphoria could and probably would have knowledge of that experience just as you have knowledge of the piece of paper blowing across your lawn. 8.2.1 An important fact about consciousness. One feature of consciousness, as philosophers use that term, is that if something has consciousness, then there is something it is like to be that thing. If you are in pain, then there is something it is like to be you. So the presence of consciousness in something is sufficient for there to be something it is like to be that thing. Further, the presence of consciousness in something is necessary for there to be something it is like to be that thing. There is nothing it is like to be pine cone, since pine cones are not conscious. But if by some miracle a pine cone were to become conscious, then there would be something it was like to be that pine cone. The presence of consciousness in something is thus both necessary and sufficient for there to be something it is like to be that thing. In fact, consciousness may be identified with the things having the property there being something it is like to be that thing. 8.2.2 An important fact about your belief that 1 plus 1 equals 2. These points can help clarify our earlier point that your belief that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is not a constituent of your consciousness, even though it may occupy your consciousness, just as the spectacle of litter blowing across a street may occupy your consciousness without, of course, being a veritable ingredient of that consciousness. Although there is something it is like to have a pain or a tickle, or to experience a sense perception, there isn't anything it is like to believe that 1 plus 1 equals 2. Of course, that belief may have effects on your consciousness. In other words, it may generate constituents of consciousness without itself being such a constituent, and there is something it is like to experience those constituents. For example, your having that belief may lead you to your getting an A on a test, which in turn may fill you with joy. 8.2.3 A consequence of this important fact, the existence of the unconscious. Thus, your belief that 1 plus 1 equals 2 is not a constituent of your consciousness. It is not like a pain or a tickle or a perception, but it is clearly conscious in some sense of the word. It is not buried in your subconscious. It isn't like the previously discussed processes by which your mind converts disturbances of your sensory surfaces into perceptions. It is not a part of your consciousness. So in that sense, it is unconscious. So to the extent that it is conscious, it is in the sense that you are conscious of it. What we just said about that particular belief is true of many, if not all, beliefs, and indeed of many desires, aspirations, regrets, intentions, and emotions. Consider your intention to receive a degree from an institution of higher learning. That intention obviously has effects on what you do. You choose to show up to class, take exams, and so on. And it therefore obviously has effects on what is occupying your consciousness. Because of that intention, you are now reading a handout and are therefore having various perceptions and feelings that are constituents of your consciousness. But that intention cannot be identified with any constituent of your consciousness. That intention continues to exist even when you are asleep. That intention is better thought of a structural fact about your mind that underlies and regulates the events that populate your consciousness without itself being such an event. Similar remarks hold with respect to, for example, your affection for certain people, your dislike of other people, your confidence in your ability to, for example, play tennis, your doubts about your ability to, for example, play the harmonica, and so on. These points give us insight into an issue of great importance. You don't have to be conscious of anything that you are in fact conscious of. You are now conscious of a piece of paper or computer screen in front of you or the words that you are now hearing. But you don't have to be, and in a few minutes you won't be. You may, at a certain moment, be conscious of the fact that you believe that 1 plus 1 equals 2. But you obviously don't have to be conscious of the fact. In fact, most of the time, you're not thinking about that fact and therefore aren't conscious of it, though you readily become so. So the truth is that we don't have to be, and in fact are usually not, conscious of much of what is in our own minds. This shows that, contrary to what a number of authors have alleged, there is at least some reason to accept the thesis, which is urged by thinkers in the psychoanalytic tradition, that we are not conscious of much of what is in our own minds. Of course, thinkers in that tradition hold not only that we aren't conscious of much of what occurs in our own minds, but also that emotional blocks may lead to our having very wrong and distorted and impoverished beliefs about our own minds. Whether that thesis is correct lies outside the scope of this book. But what seems reasonably clear is that there are good grounds for at least one contention of that school of thought, namely that we are at any given time unaware of many of the events that constitute our very own mental lives. And once this is granted, it becomes a garden variety empirical question whether, unless we take special measures to learn about ourselves, we have more than a superficial understanding of our own minds.